Women leading the world, and we could not think of a better person to lead this conversation, this conflagration, than Nely Galán. Many of you with Twin for a while remember Nely. If you haven't been with us, you don't know what's in store for you. She's a media entrepreneur par excellence, the first president of Telemundo USA, really built that property here in the US. She, along with many other media properties, she then went out and had the book Self-Made, she shared with us before, and then expanded her purview to support Latina entrepreneurs all over the country, women entrepreneurs all over the world. Nely Galán is women entrepreneurship, I'd say entrepreneurship and vision personified. Nely Galán.
Hi, everybody. What a better day to talk about women when we are approaching the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote in America, which is unbelievable. So I want to tell you all that the last 10 years for women, 10 years starting after 2008, have been so unbelievable. We have leapfrogged through so many issues. And so many of these things have started from a place of pain. So for me, I just want you to, I'll tell you how I got so involved and obsessed and found a purpose with women, particularly multicultural women entrepreneurs. I am someone who started as employee one of what is now Telemundo, worked my way up. Like so many women and so many women in the audience and so many women in the country, we're hidden figures. We're doing our job, but other women don't even know we exist. We're so celebrity driven, and yet we are the ones really changing our families and our communities. By 2008, I had become the first woman president of Telemundo. We had sold the company to NBC, and then I started 2 other businesses. And NBC became my biggest client. I became a TV producer, and I was producing like 700 TV shows for them. And they called me one day, and they said, "We need you to go on Celebrity Apprentice." I go, "What?" And they said, "Yeah, Donald Trump's not very nice to Latinas, and you know how to stand up for yourself." And so I ended up on Celebrity Apprentice, which if you're all good and pay attention, I'll tell you all the stories afterwards, because it's quite a doozy. But from that show, I went from being a hidden figure to everyone on the planet, and so many women started emailing me and calling me and saying, "How did you do that? How did you speak up to Donald Trump? Did you go to Harvard? What's your story?" And I'm like, "No, I'm an immigrant. I've had a very crazy life. I didn't do anything in a linear way." And I realized that women needed to hear the stories of other women. And in the process of all this, I got on a lot of corporations, councils, boards, and they'd all call me in and go, "Nely, how do we reach Latinas? How do we reach multicultural women?" And I'm like, why are these people so interested in these women? And finally, I get on one of Coke's marketing boards, and the president of Coke North America, Sandy Douglas, says to me, "Nely, do you not know that Latinas are the #1 emerging market in the world? Do you not know that without Latinas, and then following them very closely, African American women, Asian women, Southern Asian women, and emerging women around the world, without them, we would go broke in a couple of months if they didn't buy from us?" And I started joining all these other councils, and I realized corporate America knew something that I, as someone who ran Telemundo, didn't know. The kind of information that all these corporations had were looking at these multicultural women as the answer to the economy. And I had just gone back to school. After Celebrity Apprentice, I took a sabbatical. We'll talk about that. I needed a break. I went back to school to get a master's and doctorate in clinical psychology. And in school, what I was learning from the medical establishment is minority women were looked at as a problem. And I thought, what is that about? And so I decided to write my dissertation on these women and what was going on with them. And what I found out from the economists of all these corporations that I was in their councils is that, in fact, women were about to have another women's movement. And not just women, specifically multicultural women. And it was going to be an economic movement. Because in 2008, when the economy crashed, all these women, unfortunately for them, had become heads of households. And so they were not women that were rising up in corporations. They were actually not doing well in corporations. So they were running to entrepreneurship. And so that's when my mission started, and I took a page out of Koch's playbook, and they said, go grassroots this, go meet those women where they are, collect data, find out what's going on with them. And so I went out and started training these women because they kept saying, we need to know more about entrepreneurship. I realized there was an information gap with these women about how the American financial system worked. They were financially illiterate about how to deal in a corporation. I heard from them that working in a corporation was not pleasant. I myself running a corporation, it was very difficult for me in the filter of me as a Latina and how I was raised. It was a completely different animal, so I understood them. How did I even remotely think that in the middle of all of that economic revolution that was happening, not just with minority women here, but with emerging women around the world, that all of a sudden, we were going to start talking about other issues, that pain was hitting other points for women. Pay parity, which Hillary Clinton brought to the light with her whole no ceilings movement. And then Hollywood kind of made it popular with all these actresses saying we weren't getting paid, which is typically what happens. The marketing of Hollywood brings the ideas into the light, and then they take time to trickle down to real women. How would we ever know that the Harvey Weinstein thing would happen and that Me Too would create a revolution where women felt that finally they could speak up? Again, in a very dramatic way for Hollywood. But then a year later, a Latina, Monica Ramirez, writes a letter to the Wall Street Journal and says, why are we talking about all these celebrity women when I represent farm worker women who've had far worse sexual abuse and there's no money to help them? And because of that, those actresses raised $150 million in a legal fund for all the normal women in the rest of the country that needed legal help to fight Me Too. So Me Too, yes, incredible. Then we have the election, which I could go on and on for a year about that, and women realize that their health rights are being challenged. And we then have the Women's March that authentically, organically, through social media, through our young women came together. And we saw women for the first time stand up, show up, and start talking and having a conversation that hadn't happened. And then we've had horrible, horrible things being said about women like never before. Horrible. And I don't have to go into it, but we all know. And then minority women, and Latinas in particular, what we've had to endure. And what we've had to endure, not just about ourselves, but talking about our families and our children. And yet, with all of this, we have been quiet. And I have to thank everywhere I go, I say, I thank my African American friends, my sisters and brothers, because I don't think most of us that are multicultural realize that African Americans have held the voice for all of us in this country. And as a result of that, it's taken a toll, not just on them, but on their careers in corporate America. And I think we don't talk about that enough because I don't think we say, and it's important to say, that the reason Latinas, Asian women, South Asian women don't speak up is because our narrative is not spoken about in schools. This is a country that talks about the history of black and white people. The rest of us don't even exist. And the truth is we come from countries that when you speak up, you disappear. When we cross the border to this country, even no matter what anyone says about us, we're grateful, so we're quiet and we're under the radar. And that's part of my job through my psychology degree is to go out and say to women, we have to be louder and braver. And it's not fair to African Americans in this country to take on this burden for all of us. With that being said, I think there's a lot of hope. So much is changing. The conversation's open, and our young women, even though I know sometimes even I disagree with all our young millennials and younger because they're always on the phone or whatever, but I have a lot of hope because my son goes on social media and he says things that I can't even believe he will say. And when you look at the things that are happening, and again, these organic movements, when you see that new tennis player, Coco, and when she lost the the Open the other day, and these two women being so kind and loving to each other when so many of us were divided and conquered for so many years, and so many women treated other women poorly in corporate America and outside. We're finally realizing that together we're everything and apart we are nothing. So with that being said, I want to, two great areas of improvement have been the Congress. Women are realizing that we have to have a seat at the table. You know, when Sheryl Sandberg came out with Lean In, which I'm a big fan of hers and of the book, but to be honest, so many of us don't even get invited to the table. How can we lean in? Well, these women have decided to lean into politics. And the next place where a lot of changes have happened and more need to happen is in corporate America. Because if we're saying the #1 customers in the country are women, and even more deeply multicultural women, then we have to ask ourselves as this group, when are our companies going to look like our #1 customer? That is the question this group has to ask. And how do we achieve that? And how do we change things for women so that we are at the table and we no longer have to lean in because we are there? We have an incredible panel of women, let's bring them out right now, who are perfectly suited to talk about, come on in. Ann Bodnar, who's our Chief Administrative Officer of Willis, Tower and Watson. Kelly Chambliss, did I pronounce that right, Kelly?
Close enough.
Managing Partner at IBM, and Lorraine Hariton, President and CEO of Catalyst. Lorraine, I'm going to start with you because Catalyst has been in the business of helping women and helping corporations help women for 57 years.
Yes.
How have the last few years changed? First of all, tell us what you do and how has it changed everything, all of this conversation that's been begun by women?
Well, Nely, this is a really important moment in time, and listening to all the conversations, I think we understand that there's radical change happening right now. So talking about the workplace, I want to put some context around that. If you go back to the Industrial Revolution, before that, you know, you had people, subsistence farmers, artisans, where women and men worked together. They had roles and responsibilities based on the skill set of that moment in time. With the Industrial Revolution, men went to work, women stayed home. Women did not get paid, men got paid. So the rules of the workplace of today have their roots in the Industrial Revolution and what I call the patriarchy that was started at that point in time. In the 60s, with the women's revolution, which was, by the way, technologically driven by birth control pills that gave women a lot more latitude, and technology that was advancing, women went into the workplaces en masse. And people like Ann and I were the beneficiaries of that because I went to work for IBM. I had a great career at IBM. The CEO of IBM is a woman now, and we had a lot of opportunity. But we are still not at a place where we have equity. We don't have equity for women. We don't have equity for a lot of underserved minorities. And if you look at the workplace today, yes, 50% approximately at the bottom of the pyramid are women. But as you go up the pyramid, it gets small. It's like 25% at the middle, and it's about 7% at the top. That's the highest it's ever been.
And ethnic women even fewer.
Ethnic, multicultural women of color is still a very big issue. So we still have a lot of heavy lifting to do to change that. But companies are recognizing that. Many of you have seen that the Business Roundtable announced the change in the purpose of a company. It includes a lot of thinking about their customers, their suppliers, their communities, their supply chain, looking at how they can provide advantage to all of them. And that is driven by change culturally. It's changed by changes in millennial and Gen Z values. You know, gender itself is on a continuum now. When I look at my kids, they look at it for a much different lens. Men and women are all looking at having more balance. My very accomplished son, who was actually on stage last year, just had a baby, and He took 4 months off for paternity leave from Microsoft, and since his wife has the biological capabilities to nurse, he does all the baby diaper changing. So, you know, they're looking at things very differently. Another thing is we have major changes in the nature of work that we've all been talking about that have opportunity and peril. People are concerned about AI and bias. That means we have to really build in a more diverse group of people to work together on that. It also means that we have major reskilling, and we talked about digital and data literacy. Data literacy is something women are very good at. There's lots of opportunities around that. We can use technology to have more virtual workplaces. So we have a really unique moment in time, and companies are driven by these things that are happening to really drive to provide, and my vision is to have a more equitable, inclusive, and fulfilling workplace for everyone, where my son can both be a provider, a shared provider, and also change the baby diapers and get the fulfillment of that. And we use technology for that change.
So do you feel like companies, like it's an imperative now to do all this? It's no longer checking the box. It's something that when you go in, they're like happy to see you and saying, yeah, let's figure this out?
I absolutely think that. I am so privileged to have this job at this moment in time where it's at the top of the list. But, you know, the Me Too movement, what happens in, you know, the country and politics, all these other technology drivers are making that happen. It's driven not only because it's the right thing to do, because it's an imperative to do to be successful in the 21st century.
I think, Anne, I wanted to ask you about recruitment, because I know you have a background in being an HR person as well. And, you know, when we talk about making our companies look like us, right, it all starts with talent. And every company I go to says we can't find women, we can't find diverse people. And why is that? I mean, I sit there and go, do you have people in the HR department that look like me? Because I think they would find people that look like me. So how do we do that, and how do we like sort of leapfrog that into a place where our companies look like us?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And then the first thing I'll say is, you know, HR has a role to play, but it really starts with people who are doing the hiring. So we spend a lot of time really trying to make sure that we have diverse panels actually looking at the candidates that come through. So we have diversity perspectives brought to evaluating the candidates. Honestly, we have gender parity at the entry levels. We don't have a lot of challenges, and I think you're going to talk about this as well, Kelly. We have challenges finding talent. But gender-wise, at the entry level, we do a very, very good job, and we're very proud of it. I will say, when you get into senior hiring, it's much more challenging, frankly, because all of us are looking for the same few people. It's a pipeline issue. So you have to be much more creative, much more open, actually, to bringing people in and giving them some training, not assuming you're going to find the perfectly packaged fit. And we've been doing a lot of thinking about this, about how we actually have to change our selection criteria and not have literally every last box checked off, but to some of the things we talked about in this conference, hey, here's someone who's really demonstrated tremendous collaboration skills, has insight and a global perspective. What if we teach them, you know, how to actually do, you know, some advanced broking? That might be a better way for us forward. And we have some very, you know, experiments underway. But our challenge really is at the senior levels. But we need to bring this diverse perspective into candidate evaluation all the way through our processes. And we found that that's been actually very, very successful for us.
And then we've talked about how do you bring people in and then make sure that they're not set up to fail, that they are actually culturally and in every way fit in to the culture. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about that, Kelly?
I can. I also wanted to talk for a minute about, I feel as a business leader, a tremendous responsibility to not just sustain the progress that you talked about, Lorraine, but to accelerate it. And I'm constantly, as are many people I work with and all of you, thinking about what can we do that's really different, that would not just sustain but accelerate progress. And I personally had a little bit of an aha moment earlier this year. The IBM Institute for Business Value that Jesus mentioned this morning released a study on women leaders. And I'm reading through it thinking, I'm not going to learn anything I don't already know, right? A lot of studies on the topic. And as I'm going through it, I was like, wow, because we interviewed 2,300 organizations. And they said that 18%, a little higher than your 7%, 18% were women. Very low, right? And then 2/3 of the respondents said that the reason there weren't more women in senior leadership roles was because the women chose family over work. It's like, I don't know if that's actually true. And then I thought, okay, for us to all have an actual breakthrough here, we need to tackle unconscious bias, because it told me that a lot of unconscious bias still exists. And then I started reflecting on my own personal life, and I have an 8-year-old daughter, and she plays baseball. She doesn't play softball, she plays baseball. And I think it's a rare week that someone doesn't say to us at a practice or a game, Alexa's still playing baseball. Why didn't she move to softball? Because she likes to play baseball, right? And so we make these assumptions about what people before us have done and assume that others that come behind should or will be interested in doing the same. And so I think real meaningful change starts when our children are very young. So in our schools, on the playgrounds, really all of us collectively not putting, and you talked about this a little bit, not putting people in categories, right?
Well, and I think our kids are so much more fluid and open about everything because of all the changes that have happened and all the pioneering we've all done. Some of the kids don't even want to be us because they see that we've worked so hard, right?
Right.
I think, but they are seeing the world in a different way.
But I think,
Well, I think if we look at the issue of unconscious bias, it relates to the fact that we need to change the whole culture, and that's reflective of that. So we need to get to a more inclusive culture where there aren't these biases. We need to engage men in that, and one of the things the Catalyst spends a lot of time on, we have an initiative called MARK, Men Advocating Real Change. It is workshops that help men understand the biases and make them active advocates to make the change. As it relates to women of color and people of color in general, they have a really tough set of issues as being sort of
Yes, very.
the unusual person. They're bringing a different perspective to work where they have to consciously really work to change who they are, and that creates that can create sleeplessness, absenteeism, people leaving the job. So educating and helping people understand the differences we bring to work and create an environment that's more inclusive and understands these biases and aware of is what the hard work we need to do to get to the next level in this area.
Now, ladies, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about Me Too and Time's Up and all that. How has that affected corporate America? I mean, are men freaking out that if they do anything that something's going to go wrong? I mean, how is corporate America dealing with that?
well, I mean, look, I'll just say from my perspective, it would be naive to think that people don't kind of have some sort of concern, right? Because it actually has raised a huge spotlight on what's been probably, in some places quite acceptable behavior, which is wholly unacceptable. So, I mean, what we've found is that people will ask the question, but I actually think it's a good question, because the question's about, I really want to mentor this up-and-coming woman. I'd really like to find out what are some really appropriate ways to do that. First of all, great, you'd like to mentor them, so yay, okay, let's celebrate that. And then it's a good question. Well, let's talk about that person. What is that person really needs to do? Because there's not one size fits all for developing anyone. So I actually think the positive view, I'm a possibilist, I love that term that's here, is that is really we're asking the question and focusing on mentoring and bringing women along. There are some negative undercurrents, like we do hear people say, gee, I'm really not sure about going out for drinks. It's like, yeah, why are we going out for drinks? There's all kinds of other ways to do mentoring in the workplace. But I think the fact that we're actually having the dialogue and asking the questions and they're part of a business, conversation is really positive.
First of all, the Me Too movement has really heightened people's awareness around the issue of the cultural imbalances in power. And that's why, our program, MARK, is so popular, because men are saying, how do I help solve the problem? How do I, have a solution? Companies are doing the training they need, and there's leadership at the top saying this is not acceptable, and this is how you handle it, and these are the policies and practices, and this is how you interrupt these issues happening and how you report them. And so having the structure to support this and explaining to people how you do this effectively at work is what the good companies are doing, and I'd say most of the companies are taking that type of approach.
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually think that it's brought greater sensitivity and almost kindness back to the workplace, because I find a lot of people that I work with are more sensitive to how their actions affect others, how their words affect others. And in the cases where I've coached someone on how what they were saying or doing made someone feel, like, oh, I didn't realize that. I'm so glad you told me. So I actually think in a lot of ways, it's bringing some sensitivity and kindness back that we needed.
I'm curious, again, sitting in a lot of these meetings, I often say, why is the company not declaring, sort of taking the side of something in regard to women, or like publicly? Do you think that's the role of a corporation, or do you think that it's tough for a company to side on a woman issue or on, something that's going on in the country for women?
Well, CEO activism is becoming much more part of the CEO's role. 10, 20 years ago, that was not the case. This business roundtable change in the nature and purpose of a company really reflects this view that the CEO has to be more of an activist and take stands on different things. And in fact, in some ways, they're bringing it into their brand. For example, you saw the Nike ad or the Gillette ad, that talks about some of these things around pay equity. So I think leaders are taking more of an active role, but in a very thoughtful way.
I think it's also because young people, we now know, don't want to purchase from companies that don't stand for things.
Right.
So standing for women, and certainly standing for multicultural women, is a beautiful thing when that's your number one customer for so many companies.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think that's why Procter & Gamble has a very, getting to parity at every level, going out with commercials, just, you see that happening all over the place.
And you're seeing a lot of companies stand for diversity and inclusion. Like, we all know that diverse teams not just are higher performing and generate better business results, but solve problems more quickly, more effectively, right? Problems we've been talking about over the last couple of days: poverty, education, safety, security, the environment, right? And so I see, and I love that so many more companies, IBM included, are standing up for inclusion, making everybody feel like they belong and they matter, regardless of their background and their gender and anything else that might run the risk of putting people into categories.
Well, how about this whole thing that we've all talked about for so many years, women not helping other women? I think this idea of being divided and conquered, feeling like you're the only one, and I know because I've always been the only woman, the only Latina, whatever, and this feeling that you have that maybe there isn't more for everyone, and I think that's changing as well. How do you guys see that playing out in corporations?
I think it was, I'll have to say, I mean, I recognize, having been in the workplace for quite a long time, we don't need to say how long, I recognize the queen bee sort of, caricature. I don't really see it every day in our workplace, I have to say. I really think we're way beyond that, because just to what you said, it's really about talent is the weapon. That is the only way we're going to actually compete effectively. And so you have to actually have an attitude of, where's the best people, right, that we can get to actually solve the problems we want to deliver to our clients. I think it's a complete, if I had to pick one thing that's changed most in 40 years that I've been in the workplace, I said that number. Anyway, I think it's really been that, right, that it's not just words on inclusion, it's actually a competitive mandate, and that you build it into everything you're thinking about every day in the workplace, not HR, just how you're doing your work and serving your clients.
So specifically on this issue of women competing with women, first of all, the research shows that that is not true. I mean, there's always examples that the press can pull out and talk about, but it is not generally true. But what is also true, and this is true for any minority group, that having one person is a token.
Right.
So, for example, on the California legislation on boards, they legislated that you need 3 over time. You need to have. You can't be the odd person out, because then you're always on guard, and you need to make it part. You need to have more in the room.
So, because we're all talking about future and what does this look like, I want us all to dream. We've made so many changes in 10 years. What does the next 10 years look like? What is your dream for 10 years from now? What is the role of women in corporate America? How does it look? What does it feel like?
Well, I have 2 daughters, and I have one who's very likely to be a good CEO candidate. So I say, Catherine Bodnar rules the company. I see my daughters as a CEO, and I probably wouldn't have said that 20 years ago.
I would like to get to equity for everyone. So I think every child should have an opportunity to reach their full potential. As Hillary Clinton used to say, is that talent is universal, but opportunity is not. We want a more equitable, inclusive, and fulfilling world for everyone, and where you want to use this technology and talent, that we have for us to come to a world that's going to be better, not a world where everyone doesn't have jobs and purpose.
Yeah, I probably, when I look out 10 years, I think not having the kind of conversation we're having because we're past that, right? Because today, and I don't think change happens unless we do some things differently. We think differently. We put different processes in place to really build the high-performing, diverse teams that we need, but that the conversation almost doesn't come up anymore. We don't talk about, do you have a woman on the slate? Do you have a multicultural person on the slate? It just happens, and it's just kind of factored into our DNA and ways of working.
Well, I just want to say that on my road trip the last few years, I met Gloria Steinem. And Gloria Steinem said to me, I wish I had known then that the women's movement should have been an entrepreneurial movement. Because without economic empowerment, we can't change our families or the world. So I wish for all my women, and particularly my multicultural women, wealth building, having our own money. And I hope to see a panel like this of very multi-ethnic women running companies. And I want to see us all being paid the same as everyone else. So I say, my favorite word in Spanish, and the name of my movement is Adelante, because Adelante means let's move our butts and make it work. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.